to predict, because the past doesn't predict the future, and what happened yesterday doesn't predict tomorrow. And I think people kind of forget that. And the degree of complexity in many of our systems has really increased. So if you just think of the kinds of systems that we live with every day, right, and how the stakes of coping with complexity have increased. There's a lot of cases. Take cybercrime, for example, where it's the stakes are really, really high because we're dealing with these systems that are interconnected in unpredictable ways. So here's the fundamental dilemma, which is our environments have become more complicated, but our cognitive processes have not. I'm always reminded of some wonderful research that was done by a psychologist at Harvard Business School named Miller. And he published this fantastic article back in the 50s called The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. And it turns out that what he found was we as human beings are capable of keeping in our brains about 7 things. And once we start to try to comprehend more than about 7 things, we start to drop stuff. And so what ends up happening is we have all these cognitive biases. We have the recency effect. Something that happened yesterday is much more vivid to us than something that happened a year ago. We have the confirmation bias, which is our tendency to take in information that confirms what we already believe to be true. We have the anchoring effect, which makes, somebody makes a guess. We tend to be anchored much more closely to that guess, even if it's wildly off. So one of the dilemmas that we have is we have all these cognitive limitations that really cause us not to take in some of the aspects of complex systems. So how does this cause problems? Well, the first problem of complexity is unintended consequences. Things happen nobody expected. We have this on a kind of a macro scale, right? The whole global financial meltdown, the consequences of Lehman Brothers being shut down, which in a previous world where there wasn't so much counterparty trading wouldn't have been such a big deal. But the fact that Lehman Brothers shut down meant everybody stopped trading with each other and things came to a crashing halt. The sort of side effect of people being rewarded for making bad mortgages, for example, when you ricochet that throughout the system, it creates these big dilemmas that we have. Another one that's a little bit more humorous was the politicians in England, the parliamentarians, didn't want to take the political heat of giving themselves a raise. So in order to avoid that, what they did was they said, well, we'll allow you to take more and more of your living expenses, and the government will reimburse them. Well, by the time this got to its extreme, they were reimbursing things like moat repairs and dog food and flat-screen TVs. It just got completely out of control. So something that started as a reasonably benign topic ended up being quite negative and quite significant when it came to light. The picture on the lower left there is Winchester disk drives. There was a fascinating piece of work done by some researchers in the 80s, which showed that the market for Winchester disk drives, hard drives, was projected to grow by like 300%. In the next couple of years, and something like 125 firms entered that market, each of them looking to get just 5% of that market share. And then we have things like Sarbanes-Oxley, which lots of people have projected are producing the unintended consequence of limiting the appetite of firms to go public, particularly in the U.S. So you see there on the graph, there's been quite a drop in the number of firms that have indeed gone public. And what we're also starting to see now in that field is more and more ability of these young firms to get lots and lots of money from private investors, which is, again, reducing their appetite to go public. So one of the problems with complex systems is we tend to have these unintended consequences, and many of them are negative. And what's interesting is you can also point to positive unintended consequences. If you think about the Ford Motor Company, it was absolutely on its knees in the mid-2000s. And Alan Mulally came over from Boeing in 2006 and began a significant turnaround effort. So when all the car company CEOs were called to Washington to basically be chewed out and asked for a bailout, and some of them rather stupidly flew corporate jets there, Mulally went along because he judged that the damage to Ford's supply chains would be so significant if the other companies went under that it was worth his while to join and testify. But what became interesting was that testimony was so public that it got people's attention, and they said, wow, Ford, they actually didn't need the bailout. And it brought Ford to the consciousness of many, many Americans who had really written the company off. And in a very surprising way, it led to the unintended consequence of people saying, well, let's go see what Fords are like. So Mulally was later quoted as saying, if some marketing guy had come up with the idea of having him go down to Congress and get chewed out by Congress, but he would never have thought that was a good thing. This poster that you see on the slide is actually something he keeps in his office as a symbol of how important Ford is and how inspiring its future could be. So that's an example of a positive unintended consequence.
Rita, a couple of people have already commented on the fact that transparency, which is so aided by technology today, there's no pattern to it. It cuts both ways. So
absolutely. Yeah, and I think one of the things that we don't take into account is how widely distributed any comment, any picture, any photo, any impression can be. You know, it can get really out of control before you even know it. For example, I was talking, one of my clients is the Boots organization in the UK, and they were talking about how they're increasingly having to interact with their customers on their Facebook page more and more in real time. And in some cases, they're pretty significant corporate policy decisions that have to be agreed on very, very quickly and communicated back to their customers. And that's now increasingly the expectation. So another problem with complex systems is kind of relating to what you just said, Angela, which is where do you stand to kind of look at them? And this is a picture of Chuck Prince in Happier Days at Citigroup. And he was very famously quoted in 2007, before the financial crash, as saying, when the music's still playing, you've got to keep dancing. And he said, he told the Financial Times, well, we're still dancing. Well, if you look at what subsequently happened to Citigroup, what you had was different silos behaving in completely inconsistent ways, and no one person able to really see the entire problem. I was interviewing another banking CEO, and he said that he was astonished to find out that the very risks that their mortgage side of the house had said were too risky and that they weren't going to get involved with were being bundled and packaged by the trading side of the house. And so the very same institution was doing two completely contradictory things at the same time. And so that's a real danger when you're looking at complex systems. By now, many of your watchers will have seen this video, and if you haven't seen it, look it up on YouTube. It's absolutely hilarious, where people are often told to count the number of times a particular ball is passed by people in white shirts or black shirts. And in the middle of the video, this gorilla comes through and pounds his chest and walks off. And people are so intent on counting these bouncing balls that they miss the gorilla completely. And that's an example of what many of the psychologists have called inattentional blindness, which means we're so focused on something that we miss the obvious that could be happening all around us. And it's actually come into legal cases where people have said, wait a minute, you should have seen that. And people are saying, no, I honestly didn't see it. I missed it completely because I was focused on something else. Another challenge of complex systems is presented by rare events. So if you think about the recent, well, it was last year, the volcano that took place in Iceland, the previous rules about volcanic ash were you didn't fly through them, you just shut down. And so when the system had this rare event, an event that didn't happen very frequently, it shut down completely, stranding global travelers on either side of the Atlantic and up and down, and prompting many, many heroic returns to wherever they were going. And so the system just couldn't cope to a rare event, which didn't allow us to predict. Another thing to bear in mind when you're thinking of complex systems is this dangerous assumption that we often implicitly have, which is that the world is bell-shaped, meaning events that are sort of toward the middle are more likely, and events that are more towards the tails are less likely. And yet, in complicated systems, what we often find is the outliers are what matters. So why are we so interested in Bill Gates and Google? Well, because they're rare. We often forget that these bell-shaped curves reflect populations, not individual events, and that sometimes the most significant and most important things happen at the ends of the distribution, not in the center. And then a final thing that I think is worth mentioning about complicated systems is that that some things that happen early in a system's evolution last forever. There's a network effect that kicks in, and then you never actually get back to where you were. So a great example of this is the QW, the QWERTY keyboard. QWERTY was actually designed to put the most important keys in the English language where the typist's weakest fingers were, so that it would slow fast typists down, because the typewriters used to jam if you typed too quickly on them. That has now become the dominant layout for keyboards on everything from, clearly typewriters and laptop computers to even BlackBerries and touchscreen devices. And so this thing that was originally designed to actually create inefficiency has now become so embedded that you can't really get rid of it. So those are some of the dilemmas that I think we need to be aware of when we're thinking about complicated systems. So what do you do about it? How do you mitigate some of the difficulties of complexity? And I'd like to talk about a couple of different things that I think are somewhat counterintuitive when you're confronted with this. So the first thing I think you need to realize is that in complex systems, unlike complicated ones, optimizing, being lean, getting rid of redundancies, trying to be efficient, using sort of statistical control techniques are probably not going to be all that useful because you don't know what the outcome's going to be. And when you start to get too lean and you start to get too unredundant, as it were, too efficient, you're actually eliminating some of your capacity to cope when the unexpected happens. So I think it's really vital, especially in business, to try to understand where it makes sense to be lean. So yeah, supply chain, absolutely, and so forth. But as we saw with the Japanese earthquake, what people didn't understand until it happened was how vulnerable being just in time and being super lean was going to make you if your connections didn't work and if your regular supply didn't work. So when you think about systems that are designed for really, really high reliability in complex situations, what you find is huge amounts of investment in redundancy, in backup systems, in contingency plans, and that's really what you want to be thinking about. So essentially what you're after is two kinds of buffers. The first one is buffers in time and space. So buffering in time gives you more time to respond to a situation. Buffering in space separates elements of a system from each other so that you can then deal with them differently. You don't have to deal with them all at the same time. So the first thing I think that's important to realize is you can't understand a complex system by looking at pieces of it. You have to really see all the interdependencies and how they relate. So for instance, there's the three kinds of interdependencies that you can think about when you're designing a business system, for example. The first is you can think of it as pooled interdependence. So pooled interdependence would be like bank branches, right? What I do in branch A accumulates up to my headquarters, and what I do in branch B accumulates up to headquarters. And they don't really interact very much. So that's one of the least complex kinds of systems. Then you have sequential interdependence, which is, my supply chain leads to my raw materials input, which leads to my manufacturing capacity, which leads to my sales system. And that's a little bit more complex because each piece of the system is depending on the one that came before and giving input to the one that's to come. And then you have truly interdependent systems, and you can think about like an airline reservation system where, I decide to change my flight from Tuesday to Wednesday, and all kinds of stuff has to happen. My pricing has to change, my seat assignment has to change, my meal assignment has to change. And so the more you are working with systems that are interdependent, systemically complex, that's where these concepts really start to have a lot of purchase. So the first thing to think about is forecasting differently when you're thinking about your indicators that you're using to make decisions. And I'd like to talk about recognizing that you've always got three kinds of data that you're working with, three kinds of indicators. So lagging indicators are indicators that are behind where you are today. So most financial data, they're capturing information, but it's information about something that's already happened. You can't really change them. And most of the data that companies use to make decisions is in this bucket, unfortunately. It lags what's happening. Then you have current indicators. And current indicators you can think of like the speedometer on your car. It tells you where you are right now and sort of how high you are, what position you're in, and so forth. And some indicators that people work with in business have that kind of quality. In retail especially, they're really good at using current indicators, things like how many people are coming through the store and how many sales are being made and so forth. But the hardest, the most subjective, and often the most valuable indicators are leading indicators. And what's difficult about them is, by definition, they're not facts yet. So a leading indicator is designed to inform and alert and get you prepared for something that might happen. So one of the things to remember about leading indicators is the measure of their quality is not did they predict what happened, right? What the measure of their quality is did they motivate people to take the right action in the right time. A great example of this is the Y2K phenomenon. You all may remember this back in the mid-90s. A bunch of people said, oh my God, these computer systems all over the world where the date is only 2 digits in the database. And so come the year 2000, these computers are going to get confused and they're going to think it's 1900. A catastrophe will ensue. Airplanes will drop out of the sky and we'll all should move to Wyoming and stockpile wheat. I mean, that was the sort of idea. And it was terrifying. People were really scared by this. So what happened? Nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? It's because the leading indicators, the possible what might occur was so vivid and so powerful that people took action. And so when the big day came and went, nothing actually went wrong. And I'm going to argue that's not because the predictions were wrong. A lot of people sort of poo-pooed it, but it's not necessarily that the predictions were wrong, it's that the action was taken in time to ameliorate what could have been quite a problematic situation. So here's the practical outcome of this. When you're looking at the data that you actually use to make decisions in a complex situation, I like to get people to track the data that they use over the course of a week, say, and categorize it in terms of these 3 categories. How much do you use its lagging? So think about financial data and stuff about what happened last year, comparisons to last year, and that sort of thing. Think about what's current, what's going on right now. And then, do you have at least 5 to 10% of the information you take in on a regular basis that falls in that leading bucket, that would begin to give you some indications about what might happen? Not necessarily that it's going to, but to expand your alertness and preparedness. Together with that, what makes sense is to use alternatives to conventional forecasting techniques. And again, what we're interested here is the outliers, because the averages are often not really that important. I mean, if you just think about what's happened in the last year, we've had the continuing effects of the financial crisis. We've had the Arab Spring. We've had the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. We've had all these things that no one really could have predicted, but that when you think about their impact, were much more important than sort of average events. So why are we so interested in Apple? It's not an average company. Why did Boston Scientific ignore quality problems in guidance and continue with what Fortune came to call the second worst merger and acquisition ever? Because the little things didn't seem important at the time. And of course, it's widely known that using average data on your customers is pretty much a disaster. That what you really want is to get customers in behavioral segments so that you can appeal to customers that behave differently from one another.
Let me interrupt you. Remind us what guidance what guidance explosion point was.
Sure. Well, guidance was a spin-off of, I believe it was Eli Lilly. Anyway, guidance made hard sense. And they were jumping along very, very famously until a young person who was equipped with one of these guidance pacemakers died when it failed to jolt his heart back to life. And it turns out, upon investigation by the New York Times, that guidance management actually had known this for 2 years and had fixed the problem in the devices that were out, that were being created, that were being manufactured newly, but hadn't told doctors about patients who had the devices already installed. And so we created a huge scandal, and subsequently, after the Boston Scientific acquisition, they found that there were many quality problems throughout guidance manufacturing process. So it became something of a real drag on Boston Scientific's stock price and performance.
So the issue was that these quality program problems were known here and there throughout the organization, but there was no centralization of the data or recognition of this is a systemic problem.
Exactly. And I don't know this for a fact, but my guess is that the deal team working on the deal was isolated from the quality team looking at the product manufacturing. Right? Any other questions while we're at it? One other person asked, when you think about the companies that you work with, how many organizations are really using those leading indicators and that kind of thinking versus the lagging and current? How many percentage of companies are using those leading indicators for a real competitive advantage? I would say very few, which is one of the reasons it's such a powerful idea. The reality of company life today is people are busy. You're dealing with 400 emails a day, and you're dealing with the quarter by quarter, and you're dealing with all the noise in the system. And so to take that deep breath, to step back, to really think about what you should be looking at in the future, I think it's just getting harder and harder because people are so pressed for time. And so when these things happen, it takes everybody by surprise.
So you have one last point on your slide, and I'm sure everybody remembers the New Coke story, but how did average day-on customers lead to the creation of New Coke?
Oh, well, what happened was that this was during the era of the Pepsi wars, the soda wars, and what Coca-Cola's market research people did was they did all these market tests and found that on average people preferred a sweeter, in a blind taste test, people preferred a sweeter formulation more similar to the way that Pepsi tasted. And so they said, okay, people prefer, on average, people prefer this sweeter formulation. We're going to change the taste of Coke to be more like that. And of course, they released this thing to absolute howls of outrage from the part of their customers. And it created just enormous problems with them. Now they recovered. It brought back Coca-Cola Classic, and it ended up being actually really good for the brand, which was kind of an unexpected consequence. But the original launch of New Coke was a complete disaster. Another thing that happens in these complicated systems in terms of outliers is that sometimes events occur that are really, really extreme. Some of you may remember May 6, 2010, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost over 1,000 points. It lost 1,010 points at 2:47 in the afternoon, and by 3:07 the market had regained all of that value. So a pretty extreme case, and the unintended consequence that produced was a lot of customers had mandatory sell orders on their portfolios, so when the stock dropped to a certain level, the broker was forced to sell it. And so even though the market recovered its value, they had absorbed the losses because they had to sell, because these computer programs had sold their portfolios at the very bottom, producing all kinds of lawsuits and other unintended things. But again, what you're doing here is with this automatic sell order is you're preparing for an average slow-moving thing and not prepared for a fast, peaky kind of outlier event. So I think the way that you think about forecasting becomes pretty critical. Next, when you're thinking of investing, I'm a huge fan of investing in what I call real options, which are small investments you make today that buy you the right to take alternative courses of action in the future. So if you think about those two distributions that are pictured on the slide, the one on the left shows how, because you're able to break your decisions into steps, you break them down step by step, you actually don't take an action which is going to produce a negative consequence once you know that. And so rather than making an all-at-once, big bang, damn the torpedoes kind of investment where you're doing things in one big swoop, what you're instead doing is step by step. And so that if something's turning negative, you have the time and the energy to recoup. Similarly, if something's looking really good, you can then invest in it with a great deal of confidence. So I'm a big advocate of investing in options rather than investing in what you might think of as more of a normal distribution, net present value kind of situation. Finally, I think in business, we really underestimate the importance of storytelling, of counterfactuals, what might happen if things go differently, freeing ourselves up to be a little bit more creative, to really think about what consequences might occur if certain unpredictable and unforeseen activities came together. When you go back to an event like 9/11, all the intelligence community, everybody said, oh my God, nobody conceived of the idea that someone would fly a plane into a target. And yet, besides drama author Tom Clancy envisaged exactly that some years before in a book he was writing. And so very often we underinvest, I think, in organizations, in storytelling, in trying to expand the range of possibilities that we cognitively consider might happen. And if you think about it, how many times have you gone to a training class in management and been taught to tell stories? And yet, in many ways, that's how you're really going to get at something that's different and unique. So a great corporate best practices in this regard is Intel actually has a group of 12 science fiction writers that they have contracted with to develop stories of how the future might unfold, and then use that to help their engineers think about what kinds of chips and what kinds of devices they might need to be prepared to support. And they actually do this. And the reason I think that's so interesting is, if you hand somebody a blank piece of paper and say, tell me what a chip is going to be that we need to start developing now because devices in 2012 are going to need them, you freeze, you go, your brain would buzz. And yet, if you read a story about a life in 2020, lived the way that somebody in 2020 lives it, it definitely makes it seem more real. Another great best practice example is the Institute for the Future, which is an organization that is dedicated to helping companies think about future possibilities. And what they used to do is produce these huge, phone books type reports that landed on people's desks. People kind of would glance through them occasionally, but didn't really pay any attention to them. So what they've started to do recently is actually create artifacts. So they will, if they've got some projections about how movie ticketing or social media might affect the way that people go out, they'll actually mock up that experience. So you'll have a ticket booth of the future, and you'll have a movie theater of the future, and you can actually interact with it in real time. And it makes the cognitive appreciation of what these future systems could look like much more real. So the basic message is, when you're thinking about how you project into the future, when you're thinking about what you anticipate, you want to be expanding your range of possibilities. You want to go beyond looking at central tendencies, you want to look at outliers, you want to look at counterfactuals, and you want to think about stories. So that's the sort of cognitive angle of living with complexity. The second thing has to do with, complex systems misbehave, they do things you don't expect. How do you deal with the risk aspect of it? So even if you're thinking about it logically, how do you, now that you've appreciated what's going on, how do you actually do something about the possible downsides and the possible risk? I think one very interesting best practice is forget about prediction. Forget about prediction. Why don't you put users in charge of the critical decisions and let them work out what the system needs to look like for themselves? So take, conventional sales and marketing. So engineering dreams something up, they put it into a product, that gets handed over to marketing, marketing takes it to market, tries to sell it, and all that requires a fair amount of heroic prediction to get something that a customer is actually going to like. Contrast that instead with Lulu.com, which is an online publisher, and you put your, let's say you want to publish a book, you put your book on the Lulu website, you arrange to have people buy it, you decide what the price is, Lulu charges a small amount of commission on whatever sales occur, and then they've got a whole bunch of other services that you can select that are on their website. But what's beautiful about it is they incur absolutely no cost, and they incur no risk. So if your book's a complete piece of junk and nobody buys it, that's fine. It's just digital bits and bytes sitting on their website. If the 500 people who are really interested in, I don't know, ancient Chinese knitwear buy your book, they're making money. So they've actually eliminated the need for prediction by putting users in charge of the decisions. I would encourage you all to go visit the Lulu website. One of the funniest aspects of that website is that they have a section of it in which if you send them your rejection letters from conventional publishers, they'll actually print them on toilet paper for you. Which I always thought was fairly funny. I often get asked, well, that's publishing, that's business to consumer, what about big, heavy industrial products? If you look at the way Boeing 777 was developed, it's very much this kind of process. They had users in charge of many of the critical decisions. They had a group of, I think it was 12 or 13 of their leading airlines customers getting involved with everything. And they did a huge amount of prototyping, virtual mock-up, getting reactions from customers all along the way. So instead of creating something and hoping someone would buy it, they kind of eliminated the need for prediction at all. The next thing that I think helps with mitigating risk is thinking very consciously about, when something goes wrong, what are you going to learn from it? And how are you going to figure out how failures can tell you how a particular system is going to interact? An interesting story from the world of social benefit is a device called the play pump. And this thing years ago was hailed as the solution to water shortages in Africa. And the concept was this: it's like a little merry-go-round, and the kids would play on it, and it's attached to a pump. And the pump would then pump up this water, which would be stored in the bin you can see there at the top. And this was going to be, the second coming. This was going to be great. Well, turns out that this idea rested on a bunch of assumptions that just didn't hold. For example, the water needed to be accessible. The water needed to be high quality. It needed to be plentiful. And you had to be able to store it for some considerable period of time before it could be used in order for it to really address the water problems. And what's interesting is not so much that it didn't work out, but the organizers, such as the World Health Organization and CARE, have now tried to use what they learned about this failed experiment to really get better at addressing these water shortage problems. So I think it's a nice example of something that didn't work out. It was a pity, but they really used it very effectively to try to learn how to do things better. So it's a nice example of what I call intelligent failure, where you've got something that didn't work out, but rather than just hide or have it be undiscussable, you're making it a true learning experience. In another Harvard Business Review article that came out in April, I did talk about the principles behind intelligent failure. And a lot of times in a complex system, failing is the only way you're going to learn what you need to learn to get things right. So here are some principles to think about. You want to, first of all, define what you expected to have happen. You want to know what that was clearly. You want to have a process for taking assumptions and converting them to knowledge. You want to do it quickly. So if you're going to have failures, you want them to be quite quick. You want to be able to contain the downside risks. So back to this idea of options, step by step proceeding. You want to just experiment with a few things. You don't want to have a wildly uncertain thing. You want to celebrate if something goes wrong, but then you learn from it. And then finally, the most important is you have to have some kind of system that codifies and shares what was learned. Back to this theme of you want to make sure that when you're dealing with downside risk, that you're preparing yourself for the outliers, not for the normal. And there are some very famous academics who observed that in California, there could be as many as 16,000 earthquakes that take place every year. The big one happens once every 100 to 150 years, but which one do you want to be prepared for? Obviously, it's the big one. So you want to be thinking of what you're preparing for in terms of risks as you are thinking of how to mitigate those risks. So we talked about cognition. We've talked about how do you mitigate some of the risks. The last aspect of living with complexity that I'll talk about today has to do with the resource trade-offs that you're making. So just recall, what you're trying to do is either build yourself buffers or come up with ways to reduce the interdependency in a complex system. So buffers in time and space or limits to the interdependency that happens. So an example of two contrasting ways this happens is if you take upgrading your computer software. One of the huge benefits of something like software as a service is that the data and the system that you're using are separate. In other words, they're not interdependent. So your data in a software as a service kind of system exists, and you can upgrade the software as a service software as much as you want. Contrast that with upgrading your PC when it's running Windows. You have to unload everything. You have to completely change everything, and it can take quite a long time because your data and your operating system are intimately wound up with one another. And so one of the attractions of something like a software as a service solution is it's buffered that complexity. It's made it more easy for people to upgrade and live on the system than if it's all just mixed up together. So that's an example of the kinds of buffers that we're talking about. So the last thing has to do with how you spend your resources. A classic example is the process in medicine of triage. And if you think about it, devoting medical talent to triage, which is separating out people that need more serious and immediate attention from people that can afford to wait without coming to any harm. If you had just devoted those medical resources to helping people, you would have 100% resources devoted to helping people. But in medicine, they've realized that you're more effective for the population as a whole if you address the people that are critically hurt sooner, and the people that can wait, you buy yourself more time to deal with them. So that's an example of how you're diverting resources that could have been used for patient care, but you're buying yourself time by sequencing differently. In business, an equivalent might be taking someone who's really, really talented, but using them to establish priorities, using them to do some of this thinking, using them to develop some of these forward-looking ideas, rather than having them work. So essentially what you're doing here is delaying your commitments for as long as possible so that you can get more information, so that you can buy yourself time before you have to be committed to a specific course of action. The next thing that I think a lot of companies underestimate is the power of redundancy and the power of having resources stockpiled. In many companies, in companies in highly dynamic environments, they'll actually allow duplicate processes. They'll allow redundancy. They'll allow things to be excessive. They'll each division, for example, might have its own IT department. And while that seems inefficient, what happens is when something goes wrong in one part of the system, it creates resource that can be called on in the event of a system failure. So, for example, Nucor Steel, which is a mini-mill manufacturer of steel, has this principle that they have these redundant resources in each of their divisions. And each of their plants are absolutely systematized. So when there's a problem, when there's an earthquake, when there's a storm, when there's an electrical outlet problem, engineers, scientists, and designers from one part of the company can travel to the part of the company that's affected, and they're instantly useful. They can instantly be put to work to shore up whatever part of the system isn't working. So that's an example. Cemex, the Mexican cement producer, is famous for implementing what they call the Cemex way, which creates redundancy and consistency across all their units. So, the natural gas pipe is painted a certain color, and it's painted that color everywhere in the world, and there are redundant supplies of them, so that when something goes wrong, they can instantly bring in duplicate resources. This is actually well known among communities that have to respond quickly in the event of emergency or disaster. And the watchword here is time is your friend before a disaster and your enemy afterward. So if you're designing to cope with a complex system, you want to make sure you build in enough resources to give yourself time. Now, another thing that's kind of counterintuitive to a lot of business people that I talk to is there's this idea that if you really tightly specify what people are supposed to do, that you'll get more control, that's equivalent to having more control over things. And what scientists who study complexity have learned is that's actually not true. What you want to control is the premises under which people act, rather than specifying exactly what they're supposed to do. So in business, the most common example is Nordstrom's famous rule. So welcome to Nordstrom. We're glad to have you with our company. Our number one goal is to provide outstanding customer service. So that's the premise. Set both your personal and professional goals high. We have great confidence in your ability to achieve them. Nordstrom rules. Rule number one, use your good judgment in all situations. There will be no additional rules. So what they're doing is empowering people to behave in a way that's consistent with what customers need without telling them, walk 3 feet to here and turn around there and, and so forth, because they want their staff to be able to adapt. Now, at the same time, very strong company culture, very strong training, very strong principles that make sure that people understand the premises under which they're supposed to be operating, rather than telling them exactly what to do. So think about that in the context of your own company. If you were to ask sort of 3 people picked at random, what are the basic premises under which you operate? Would you get back something that's kind of similar? Would you get back something that reflects what your company is trying to accomplish? Another great example, because Nordstrom is very well known, but another great example of this is Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Everybody in that company starts off washing cars and serving customers, and the senior leadership comes up through that. So by the time they're making decisions at the top of the company, they've really understood how the whole system works. So I think that's another great example of what I'll call premise control. Another kind of counterintuitive thing about dealing with complex systems is an insight that a sociologist named Aaron Wildavsky developed, which he says what tends to happen is organizations over-invest in prevention and under-invest in resilience. And it's a little counterintuitive, but what he says is if you've never had a failure, if you've never had something that went wrong, if you've never had a problem, it's very, very difficult to envision having a problem. And so what I encourage folks to do, in addition to this idea of intelligent failing, is to think about ways that you can stress test your system so that people at least have the experience of things that are unexpected happening without having to experience a crushing, terrible failure. At Sony, for example, the senior leaders at Sony had such success with world-beating products that when technology moved on, they were left flat-footed. It just never occurred to them that something could happen that would undermine their business. And yet, very, very quickly, digitization and electronic media became very powerful, making a lot of Sony's signature products irrelevant. By analogy, you can think about this kind of like the immune system. I don't know about you, but when my kids were in daycare, they were coming home every other month with ear infections and nosebleeds and, God knows what, that they picked up from being cheek by jowl with all the other kids. When they got to grade school, their colleagues, who had been kept in these beautifully clean, wonderful suburban homes, were constantly getting sick because they had never been exposed to these bugs, and so they really didn't have a way of responding. Similarly, when your environment is very, very stable and doesn't change, and there's not a lot of change in it, and then something happens at a systemic level, the whole thing can die out at once. So companies can go bankrupt very, very quickly. And a corporate example of this would be Kodak. I grew up in Rochester, New York, and Kodak was this just amazingly monolithic and stable company. And to the point where, as things started to change, even though they saw it, even though they knew that the world was going to be different, they were just unable to mount an effective response because the established portions of the company were just so overwhelmingly stable and consistent. So, you want to be thinking about introducing perhaps some deliberate instability, some deliberate change, exposing people to somewhat different environments so that they see things differently. Just recently, as an example of this, I was working in an executive education program for Deutsche Telekom, which is one of Columbia's executive clients. And instead of using a canned case, or instead of just using their own situation, what we actually had them do was act as consultants to another organization. So they actually went to this organization's shops and came back and reported on how that organization could use information and communication technologies to better improve their business. And what was so fascinating to me was the two companies had blind spots in completely different places. And so by doing this assignment, they were able to really learn from each other in a way that they never would have had they just remained in their own culture and with their own environment. So I think it's worth thinking about this quote from Moldavsky when you're thinking about designing complex systems. He said, the experience of being able to overcome unexpected danger may increase long-term safety, but ironically, maintaining a state of continuous safety may be extremely dangerous. Keeping out of harm's way may actually be harmful. And I thought that was kind of counterintuitive, but very, very interesting. So let me wrap up, and then we can move on to some questions. We are, I believe, coping with more interconnected multiplicity and rapidly amplifying systems than ever before. So we really are dealing with more complexity than we ever have to. So some things I think are worth thinking about is changing the way you forecast, so build in those leading indicators, changing the view you have of risk, think about different ways of mitigating risk, and consider how you allocate your resources so that you may actually find you're not optimizing, but you are investing in building resilience into your organization. One last thing that's kind of optimistic, complex systems have brought us wonderful things. They've brought us the ability to communicate and to reach and to connect in ways that were just never possible before. So I think there's some positive aspects to it as well as the sometimes scary negative aspects.
Rita, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. We have a lot of questions. If you are listening and you want to ask a question, just click on that question icon in your upper left-hand corner and send in your comments. Let me just jump right in here. I can see from the questions that are coming in that people are kind of struggling with this issue to be or not to be interdependent. And there's one school of folks listening who say, well, should you be trying to eliminate some interdependence, and how do you do that? And then we have the other school that says, isn't the problem in most organizations is they don't really see the interdependence, and that's my biggest problem as a manager. Can you comment on that? But the need, first of all, let's start with question number one. So should you be focusing on eliminating interdependence, and is there ever a time that it's right to do that?
Well, I think if you go back to the example of the software, my sense is you want to eliminate interdependence when something could really blow up in a very negative way, or when the extent to which you're interdependent interferes with your user or customer experience in some meaningful way. The case for interdependence is very powerful. By linking up systems, you can communicate more quickly. You can vastly reduce costs. If you think about enterprise resource planning systems, you can tell somebody bought a pair of shoes at Milwaukee and you need to make a pair of shoes. So there's a lot of financial and other benefits for creating interdependence. But I do agree. I think one of the biggest downsides is people just don't see what they've created. So you link up systems and link up systems and link up systems, and all of a sudden they're linked in ways nobody ever thought. And that's where it starts to get really dangerous.
Right. One person said that's particularly important and a real challenge in the whole area of risk management, because working in a company that has to have a lot of compliance documented because they're a highly regulated industry, because it doesn't really always make them better able to deal with complexity because they're not seeing the big picture. They're so focused only on the things from which they have to be compliant.
And you're absolutely right. And this is back to this idea of premise controls versus microcontrols. A lot of our compliance culture in the U.S. is all around the letter of obedience, as it were. So did you check this box? Did you file that form? And it really misses the big picture completely.
So we have a couple other questions about people asking, well, how do you get the organization to see the value of leading indicators? One person said, how can I influence senior leaders on this whole issue without seeming like a doom merchant?
Oh, that's great. A couple of thoughts. The first one is, it doesn't have to be grim. You can do it in a more playful way. So some techniques I've used quite often are, write a newspaper story from the future with 3 or 4 different scenarios. One of which is the one you're worried about. I've asked people to role play. You can do wargaming. So one technique I've done is I've had people say role play their competitors or role play a new entrant to the industry. At GE, they very famously, Jack Welch had each leader in the company do a destroyyourbusiness.com exercise when the internet started becoming a reality. So what I think you want to do is do it in a way that's a little bit playful, but that does get the point across. So think about that rather than giving them, dark, grim, horrible stuff.
Are you advising that? Because several people ask, well, how do you decide what should be your leading indicators? Do you have any kind of template for that? Do you see companies putting a certain kind of system in place for evaluating and constantly changing them?
The best practice companies do. Probably the field that does this most systematically is the whole field of competitive intelligence, in which people like Leonard Fold are very well known as assembling these kind of leading indicators. The best practice I have is to think about future events, and that becomes your time zero event. So, in answer to the question, what would absolutely be a terrible outcome for our business? So I'll give a specific example for a company I was working with that sells life insurance annuities. And one of the big dilemmas in that area is what's called stranger-owned life insurance. So you take out a policy on my life, and you benefit if I die. So now what's interesting is those things are starting to be traded on the open market. So when you're thinking of selling annuities, a big future world that would be quite desperate for you is if there was actually an efficient traded market for these things rather than having them sold by brokers. And so we did a whole exercise around, what if by the period 2020, 50% of all of these kinds of products were sold on some kind of open market. And then we worked on scenarios around that. So, what you want to be thinking of are what are some future key positive or negative events that could have a huge bearing on your business, and then work backward in time to see what would the indicators be today that might be or might not be happening. And that's one best practice I can recommend.
Well, someone else says, much of what you say seems to me to go against modern project management. Is project management good for complex systems management?
I don't think it is. I don't think
it has to play that way.
Sure. Project management assumes that you know what you're doing. Conventional project management, where you've got all the stages and sequences and so forth, says, okay, step A leads, it's sequential, but step A leads to step B leads to step C, and if we get step A right, then step B will fall into place and so forth. But what happens if during step B, all of a sudden someone comes along and says, whoa, Z just happened, we need to change? Conventional project management doesn't really deal with that very well. This is something I've done a lot in my work with new business development, specifically with this technique I use called discovery-driven planning, where the basic assertion is you really don't know. So what you're going to do is plan to learn. And a lot of modern project management really doesn't permit a whole lot of learning once you've got the plan established. Let me also point out, this is one of the reasons why I think we have so much difficulty with complex computer systems development. For example, in the UK, they just abandoned, I think it's a £16 billion medical project for the NHS after already spending something like $2 billion on it because they said it's just not going well. We can't track it. And I would argue that they're trying to develop a complex computer system with tools that are suited to complicated computer systems.
Well, that's interesting because somebody else asked, do you have any thoughts on how systems ought to be designed in the future so that patterns rather than raw data are stored and accessed in a more efficient way? That is power strategy.
Right. Yeah, I think computing capacity and our own ability to analyze data are just beginning to start to get to these kinds of interrelations. So an example would be, right now, you've got systems that can tell you if I'll use the example of this retail company that I work with. They can tell if you're coming into the shop and you have a certain path through the floor, you do certain things, they can actually now begin to predict what you're likely to buy, what your price point is, and what kind of promotions to target at you. So they've got a little kiosk in the store, you put in your loyalty card, and they can kind of predict what it is you'll be most open to. So those are some of the early examples of these kinds of systems, but I think we're going to see a lot more of this because the conventional project management, conventional analytic techniques have let us down so badly.
A couple of people asked a version of this question, which is, can we really say that outliers are under our control, and can we really predict what's going to happen? And I think what they're trying to get to is, are you saying that you should be able to predict what bad things could happen, or should you be able to prepare a system to deal with a multiplicity of bad things that will happen?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, go back to Wildowski. You have two things you can do. You can predict and prepare, or you can build your systems to be resilient if and when something happens. So in a situation where you can't really predict, I think then what you want to be investing in is resilience, where that means redundancy, spare resources, some backup plans, contingency plans. If you go back to 9/11, right, a lot of the big financial services and telecom companies completely did not foresee that an entire physical infrastructure could collapse. As a consequence, they didn't have redundancy built in, and they were scrambling like crazy to try to bring everything back online because they didn't have that ability to respond. So, I think it's almost impossible to predict accurately. So, predict what you can and prepare for what you can't. I guess would be the watchword I would use there.
So let's talk a little bit about failures that you actually intentionally create. That is going back to your question for intelligent failures. This person asked, well, the public sector, but I would also say probably publicly held companies, they have zero tolerance for failures. So how do you allow for intelligent failures? How can you have them happen?
Well, the first concept is, it happens anyway. So whether you, you just have to look around, my God. I think the problem is if you have a zero failure tolerance policy, what you're going to get is stupid, hidden, non-learning rich failures. You're going to not take advantage of the failures that occur. So I think step one is recognizing that failures will occur. Step two is saying, how do we set ourselves up so that if and when they occur, we really benefit from them. Alan Mullally at Ford has a great phrase for this. He says, you can't manage a secret. I want to know what's going on so that we can marshal our resources and fix it. And I think the problem with this sort of no tolerance for failure is that it drives it underground. What then happens is nobody talks about it. Everybody tries to hide it. The data, by the time senior leaders find out, the thing has gone so far wrong that it creates a catastrophe. I mean, look at what just happened at UBS, right? A failure that was trying to be hidden, it ended up costing the bank over $2 billion. So I think it makes no sense to say we're not going to have failures because they are going to happen. And so my encouragement would be try to catch them early, try to make them visible, try to marshal your resources so that you learn from them, and try to have an honest conversation within your organizations about what you're going to do in the event something goes wrong.
So are you saying that if you have that kind of system thinking and culture in place, you'll be more willing to take on risk, you won't shy away from risk that may give you that competitive advantage?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you go back to Apple, which is a wonderful example and a wonderful company, they have failed so many times, and we, A, forgive them, and B, forget.
Great example. Great example. This has been a great discussion, but we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for talking with us today. I want to thank all of you for the very good discussion, and I want to thank Zurich for making it all possible. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.
Thanks.
¿Listo? Bueno, entonces quedó grabado, ¿cierto?
Sí, señor. Pero pues la imagen no es que sea muy buena, más que todo es el audio, ¿no es cierto?
Sí, sobre todo me interesa el audio.
Ah, bueno, listo.
De hecho, pues la imagen, ¿qué importa? Si últimamente los webinars que hemos visto aquí, pues o sea, los expositores no se han visto.
Ah, bueno.
Y lo que son las diapositivas, incluso ellos mandan el PDF. Entonces,
bueno,
realmente el audio es lo único que hay allí.
listo.
Gracias.